Kuzangpo, a few days ago, Bhutan hosted Sustainable Finance for Tiger Landscapes Conference. During that conference, UNDP presented a fund called Tiger Landscapes Investment Fund, one of the financing mechanisms to achieve the $1 billion USD goal in the next 10 years. Now, to talk more on this, I'm in conversation with Maxim Vergeichick, who is the senior nature economist with UNDP. So Maxim, thank you so much for joining us today. To kickstart, Maxim, how was your impression from the conference that you attended a few days ago?
I think this was new in a way that for the first time you had discussions that went beyond classic financing means, grant financing for taiga conservation and restoration, habitat restoration, and it was for the first time when we heard a suggestion of instruments that could potentially be deployed with engagement of private sector and enable financing for tigers in the long term. The problem is that financing tigers through project-based approach, 4 years project, runs the risk of once the activities stop, actually, situation goes back to threatening status, and you remedy it through investment strategies that are long-term. So I think the conference, in many ways, while it wasn't a breakthrough with respect to somebody coming and taking out of the pocket $1 billion, in a way was preparing very strong ground for moving towards the target that it set through the mechanisms, a diversity of mechanisms that were presented. So in that sense, it fully met my expectation, and I think it was a very calm and constructive discussion among partners from different constituencies, so to speak, where even sometimes the language that they're using is not entirely understood by each other, so that takes a bit of time. And so the conference presented a fantastic opportunity, and for that I think we all are grateful to Her Majesty for the patronage for the conference. Fantastic opportunity to have these discussions and to be able to listen to each other, to start constructing these partnerships and move towards the target that the conference set.
So Maxim, for the sustainable financing, UNDP, I believe, presented a fund called Tiger Landscapes Investment Fund. Now, what is this fund about? And we know that there are so many other kinds of funds out there. How is this Tiger Landscapes Investment Fund different from other funds?
So we were asked by the coalition, the Tiger Coalition, to focus on instruments that would involve private investment. Tiger Landscapes Investment Fund is not a panacea, is not the way to achieve the 1 billion, but it's one of the instruments where private investments could participate. And what makes it different is that it proposes for the first time that the investment decision-making committee includes conservationists represented by the Tiger Conservation Coalition, as well as investors in one panel, essentially. We did an analysis in UNDP of funds that are available out there, where you have the mode of decision-making which actually involves those who are caring about conservation and those who are actually looking for profit. And we found no fund that is available in Southeast Asia that works on the terms that we have envisaged for the fund and on this principle of collaboration between the conservation community and the investment community. There are a few in Latin America, but not in Southeast Asia. What it is, it proposes, it is actually a classic so-called blended fund structure, where 50% of the fund is expected to be mobilized from senior, so-called senior investors. 35% is expected to come from so-called concessional financing institutions like multilateral development banks, and the remaining portion is going to come from donors, grant capital. That actually creates a structure which allows to offer loans to ultimate beneficiaries such as small and medium enterprises in the target range countries at a rate that is significantly lower than the market rate. That's the idea. So basically this is a classic blended instrument. The exceptionality of it is through the fact that it is going to involve that decision-making structure about proposals that combines those who care about the impact for tigers and those who are actually in for profit.
So which means the fund that we are talking about is not there yet. How's the status of the fund right now?
The fund is not there yet. The idea was indeed to take it very carefully. As I mentioned in the conference, the principle of rushing slowly is very important here. We are presenting the concept. We have developed an initial outline based on the request of the Tiger Coalition, and we're in conversation with investment banks, and we would like to take care about making sure that everybody really understands what the fund is, as per your question on the one hand, but also we have a pipeline, an initial pipeline to invest into, and that takes time. So we presented the concept because we wanted the world to start hearing about the fund and coming to us with questions, with criticism, offers of partnership. Between now and the Conference of Parties 16, we hope we can complete the outstanding work on the fund, and that the idea is to announce it at COP 16. So that's where we are.
Yeah, earlier you mentioned that now 50% of the funds, it's going to come from the senior investor or the private investors. Now, what makes you believe that these private investors will be interested in funding, giving their money for the fund?
Amazing question. And yes, we believe that it is the right moment for this kind of funds, because the world in the past year has seen increased, I wouldn't call it a pressure, but increased concentration on creating standards for the private sector to start reporting on risks to nature, but also noting opportunities for nature investment. And so the platforms such as Task Force on Nature-related Financial Disclosures, or then the standards such as nature standards by the Science Based Target Network are out there. And we know that they already have cohorts of the so-called initial adopters, which are corporate and finance sector. Both of them are actually eagerly going into the adoption of these principles. But it is time to propose instruments which help them to implement their ambition to commit to nature reduction risks on the one hand, and then practically invest in nature opportunities. And Southeast Asia in particularly, the Tiger Range countries are coinciding with the presence of the corporate sector, which is sourcing commodities out of here, and which is in the spotlight for reporting on nature risks, as well as using opportunities for investment in nature. That makes us actually believe that yes, we are in the right moment to propose to senior investors some form of that structure that we have in the Tiger Landscapes Investment Fund.
So who will be able to access to this fund?
I think this was a question which from the beginning had been on our minds and the minds of anybody we talked from the investments angle and as well as conservation. And what's clear is that the work in the economic, so the idea is to target economic actors in the four sectors, in tourism, agribusinesses, forestry, as well as in the area of conservation, through opportunities to raise capital, as I mentioned, at least half the interest rate below the market rate. But we were clear that the most of the businesses here are actually happening through small and medium enterprises. So it's not a fund that is going to be targeting huge companies which are borrowing 10 million, 15, 50 million. It is a fund that is aiming to reach out to those who are able and interested to borrow between 500,000 and 5 million in loans. So this is the audience, small and medium enterprises. As long as the business proposal comes with the understanding that it is not just a business proposal at a discount rate, but it comes with the need to present in their business strategy the set of clarity for the set of indicators about how that business proposal relates to tiger habitats or threat reduction to tiger. Right. That's the idea.
So, taking this into the Bhutan's context, how do you think, do you have some kind of a plan about how this fund will be used in Bhutan?
Bhutan is one of the countries we consider in the, so the fund, the idea, let me just go back a little bit. The idea of the fund is not to start covering all 14 countries immediately. That would basically financially make little sense. It's a risky enterprise, we admit that, and it's been clear in our conversation with investors as well that we would like to do it in phases. So the first phase, where we expect a capitalization of 100 million and run for 4 years or so, will cover initially 3 countries, and one of them is Bhutan. But the main homework that we have in Bhutan is to create to identify the pipeline of investable opportunities. As I mentioned, the idea is to target small and medium enterprises who are interested or are present or planning to be present in the country, to create a business in the country, and then be able or would be interested to borrow at below market interest rate. Whether we are able to identify those will be clear in the next couple of weeks when we start to work on pipeline for Bhutan. And there's few ideas we've already discussed, and I'm actually here not just for the conference but also for conversations with the government officials as well as non-government organizations about the specific case of Bhutan, which I admit is different than mega commodity countries like Malaysia and Indonesia, but nonetheless, we have funds and commitment to define opportunities for creating pipeline that could ultimately be fitting in. I could mention that it could be actually an area of sustainable forest management in principle. I'm afraid I can't go further into details. These details would actually need to be fleshed out, as I mentioned, through meticulous demand and supply side opportunities. But my view, my intuition, that at least a couple of ideas, proposals would be eligible. So once the fund is launched, we first need to launch the fund in parallel while we work on the pipeline for Bhutan and complete the studies. See this ready by the time the fund is launched, hopefully Bhutan will be able to benefit from it.
So Maxim, when we talk about conservation, I'm very curious to know from you, when we talk about conservation, Bhutan, as we know, is globally known for being a conservation champion. But getting this title, it comes with a lot of cost. So, for example, increasing human life, wildlife conflict in some places, and decreasing developmental activities. So, what are your views on this as a nature economist?
And that actually is a question which goes beyond the Tiger Landscapes Investment Fund, and it actually takes us into the context of Bhutan, which I said is specific, and it is. When I ever ask us a question, okay, what does it look like for a country to be net zero and nature positive? Here you are, welcome to Bhutan. But as you said, and as basically government recognizes, the country recognizes, it comes at a cost. And it is very tangible cost. I was told at least 40% of crops are lost to human-wildlife conflict. And you can measure that in dollars, which could contribute to the growth of GDP if it weren't for the fact that Bhutanese culture doesn't allow to use a gun to deal with wildlife. And what we have, we end up in a situation of where I believe there's an ethical question, because what happens is the country is protecting natural capital and contributing to climate mitigation, which are both internationally important issues. Tigers, elephants, the biodiversity that you have here has international values recognized in the conventions. Who pays for that currently? Citizens of Bhutan. Is this fair? I'm afraid not. So one of the areas of my focus on this mission, and going forward, collaborating with the country office and then with the government and non-government, is to see whether opportunities such as the Gyaltsun Mindful City, for example, open up a chance for us to actually rethink this fairness model. If the private sector, is a private capital, private investors are to come to Bhutan, perhaps it's time also to see a way for them to realize that they are benefiting, they're marketing, they're banking on the capital for the maintenance of which there's a price. So we are, I probably it would be too provocative to go into specifics, but there are ways to suggest concrete mechanisms of how protected areas, for example, could be supported through different non-government ways of support or financial, budgeting, through involvement of, for example, concessions or involvement of forms of royalties. I mean, this is some of the instruments that have been tested in other parts of the world, which we were willing to see to what extent we could deploy. And again, we're rushing slowly. It's not that it's one size fits all. We have BioFin program which will invest resources into researching whether these instruments are applicable, and if yes, then how. And we will do it together with all the stakeholders in Bhutan, and ultimately if any of these work, we will be absolutely happy to see citizens of Bhutan ultimately being not as much burdened and recognizing that the international community is actually participating in meaningfully through financial resources.
So Maxim, now one of the very pertinent issues here in Bhutan when it comes to tiger affecting local communities is in Tongsa. A lot of local communities there have been affected truly. Now, as a nature economist, do you have some kind of suggestion as to how the government should intervene, and then how perhaps the fund could play its role in the near future for these local communities?
We have a mix of issues to be handled here, and I think the issue of handling the human-wildlife conflict deserves looking into issues such as insurance. This is what our BioFin program also works with the government. So there are different ways of how some of them may work, some may not necessarily work. But basically the Tiger Landscape Investments Fund, as I mentioned, is targeting not communities but small and medium enterprises. So I would say that we are here facing a situation where we have instruments that we need to recognize that some of them work for specific cases, some of them actually require application outside of the Tiger Landscapes Investment Fund in Bhutan. So I would say the BioFin program is exactly here to take stock of what works where, and if investment schemes work in particular protected areas or next to protected areas where farmers are situated, that's the mechanism. If the small and medium enterprises in the forest sector, for example, are emerging and are eligible for receiving financing from the Tiger Landscapes Investment Fund, that's going to be that case. So there's the answer. In short, to summarize, the answer is there's no, again, it's very difficult to envisage this one size fits all. It actually has to be very specifically looked into, particular case, particular situations. Is it community managed? Is it enterprise managed? And that's exactly why BioFin offers its services to the government to look into this kind of difficulties or diversity of situations, which then translate into diversity of instruments.
Mm-hmm. So Maxim, now as a nature economist, I'm sure these local communities just want to poach those tigers whenever they're affected, because we also truly can empathize and sympathize these people. But I want you to share why it is important to save tigers.
See, the view here, and it's basically takes me to the conservation, putting on my conservation hat, tigers is actually just an emblem, an indicator, a cherry on top of pie, whatever you call it, apex species, and the top predator on top of food chain. As long as tigers are doing fine, it's an indication that the ecosystem under the tiger is doing fine, and the ecosystem is concrete land where people live. As long as tigers are absent, it means something's wrong with the ecosystem, and as a result, the economic models that are happening in the land where tigers used to roam or where their populations are reducing probably are not going to be sustained in the long term. They may transform the way people do economics, but basically they will not reconcile nature and human development. This is, at least for Bhutan, this runs counter to your values of basically being part of nature, living with nature. So essentially economic activities, and threats come from people. Threats come from people. Economic activities should be the target of intervention. That's exactly the rationale behind the Tiger Landscapes Investment Fund, that it targets economic activities which are related to the maintenance of the habitat of tigers and related to the maintenance of the amount of prey and the quality of prey for tigers. If tigers are doing fine, then people are doing fine. That's the basically summary of the principle we're dealing with here.
Right. So, because we are running out of time, before we end this conversation, do you have anything you want to say about it?
I wanted to say that it's my first time in Bhutan, and it's a fantastic impression. It's basically, as I say, when we were in UNDP we have a philosophy about how to deal with, how to help put up nature values up there on the agenda of development. And I was telling my colleagues and my supervisors as well that it seems like the whole agenda of the government of Bhutan is exactly the whole agenda of our nature hub. We call it nature hub in UNDP. So therefore, sometimes when I'm just working around, we have been working around and conversing with people, it's this principle of gross national happiness. You almost like feel it tangibly. So it's been a fantastic impression.
Okay, Maxim. So it was wonderful talking to you today. Thank you so much for joining us again today.
It's a pleasure. Thank you too.